Welcome. Lisa, Allison, and I are so excited to spend the next hour with you talking about a topic that we love and it looks like so many of you are interested in. A couple of housekeeping notes. We will be recording this webinar and sharing the recording tomorrow, so don't feel like you have to scribe every number because this presentation has a lot of numbers in it. It's not the story, but there are some stats that people care about. We'll also send the materials themselves, including our guide to admissions at highly selective schools. And this is the first of a two webinar series on the results from this season. So we start with highly selective schools. And then in about a month and a half, we'll take the lens all the way out after we've had the time to unpack and analyze admissions results from all schools. We'll come back in the middle of May and do that. This webinar often surfaces questions. Some of them will be so precise to a student that it's probably better answered one-on-one, and we'll have the chance for that in a follow-up. Some of the questions are universal, and we definitely want to answer them. If you would use the Q&A function here in Zoom, it'll make it easier for us to track those questions. And many of you shared questions when you registered, and we've made every effort to make sure where we can, those questions are answered. But again, welcome. Lisa Van Carlton started this company 16 years ago, and we have been so lucky to work with hundreds of kids. Many of them are at the highly selective colleges that we're talking about tonight. And so, what we're going to try to do is really, and Athen, we're going to get to that, I promise. We're going to get to the definition of a highly selective school very quickly, but we're going to talk about what they look for, what depth means, and then sort of game plan wise, what students and parents ought to be focusing on if highly selective schools are a part of their list. Now, Lisa, could you start us off answering this question of what do we mean by highly selective colleges?
Absolutely. So, everyone could have a different definition of highly selective colleges. And one of the things that we have seen in recent years is that the colleges are going down so quickly that you really would, for our sake, we term 20% or less a highly selective college. And as you look at building a list, I think that's a very prudent thing to do because the college that's 20% this year is very likely to be 15% next year at the way things are going. So if we look at there's 62 highly selective colleges in 2019. There's now 71. The other thing to note is that quite a lot of these colleges have become less than 5%. So we see where the 20% college has gone down, the 10% college has gone down. So we see a very intense application process that is hard to kind of take is that the most likely option there is that one would get denied. Now, the good news is this is not a Debbie Downer presentation. We are lucky, as are many people across the country, to work with students who have great success in highly selective colleges. But it is an intense, holistic process. And one of the things that I think is unfortunate is this small number of colleges, because that's really a drop in the bucket when we think about the colleges in the United States get almost all the focus. And so tonight we are going to focus on this subset because it's why you came here and there's a lot to learn for people who are interested in highly selective colleges. But I think it is worth noting that there are also many other great colleges out there.
Lisa, is highly selective college the same thing as a reach school?
I think a lot of these terms that were popular are not as useful anymore. So I think that, you know, it depends the student, right? For some students, a reach school might be a school that is not near this competitive, right? So that determines a student's academic profile. I think what's hard for students and families today to understand, and as we unpack numbers, I think it kind of, the story starts to tell itself, is that no matter how great a student is, highly selective colleges are highly selective for everyone. So if you want to use the term reach, I think that's appropriate. All right, highly selective colleges are only 29% of the universities that only 29%. Let's start again. 29 colleges and universities admit less than 10%. And yet, when we start building lists with kids, those are the colleges that everybody wants on their list, right? Because they're the ones that we've all heard about. And then 42 are admitting 11 to 20%. So that kind of tells you, if you just think about supply and demand, if everyone's talking about this small subset of schools, that's not a lot. Bob, you want to talk about the other numbers?
Yeah, it's a observation that we had a student this year sort of frame in sort of the observation that it's a dog chasing its tail, that we're in a phenomenon over the pandemic that schools went test optional. And as a result, kids who in the past wouldn't have applied to some highly selective schools because of their test score, they ended up applying to more highly selective schools. And so as a result, those highly selective schools became even more highly selective. Since the pandemic, these 71 most selective schools as a group, applications have grown to those schools by 35%. It's sort of jaw-dropping when you look at it in aggregate because you're really seeing these are popular schools. As Lisa said, these are often the schools that at a high school main are the main schools that students and parents talk about. And as a result, it's really flooded many of these schools with applications.
And so this is no, we used to think of highly selective schools as the Ivies, MIT, and Stanford, right? And now what we see is this has really spread out. And if you're like me and old and you've seen, been in this game a long time, some of the schools on here are really hard for me to believe, right? But they are there and they're within this highly selective group. So when we're building lists, what becomes complicated is then everyone's looking for the next best thing from the Ivy if they can't get in the Ivy. And now those have become more. So it's been a trickle down effect because what Bob just said about that 35% increase. And so I think when we get into numbers, you'll see, just how much that's been. And here's some other schools falling into those same categories. And one of the things that you're noticing is this is no longer just private schools. This is also public flagships. And so right now, a lot of students are interested in public flagships because they like the big schools and the rah-rah. So these schools that have that and the highly selective are very, very attractive. At the same time, these state schools are trying to manage yield. So how do they know that students are actually going to go to that college versus choosing a higher up college? So that all creates some of the chaos in the system that we have in college admissions right now, especially in the highly selectives.
Lisa, can you talk for a minute about for these flagships, the sort of impact of being an out-of-state student versus an in-state student?
Absolutely. I think it varies a little bit by depending on what school. For example, if you were to take a North Carolina where they take so few out of states, UT takes a few out of state. I think that it becomes even more difficult. And I think sometimes what happens with students is they look at the overall acceptance rate in a state school and aren't able to hone it down into the out of state. And so and those things can shift a lot. We see the California system kind of love out of state students and then hate out, then they want to take more in state. So we see some fluctuations there. Again, what happens is it becomes harder and harder to predict what's going to happen in a given year.
Great. One of the other phenomenons, Lisa, is this idea of highly selective majors. What does that mean?
Well, I think one of the things we've seen is that there are certain majors that really make a student's list. Like if your list was here, you're going to need to drop it a whole standard deviation. Oftentimes one of those majors is computer science. It'll be interesting to see if that holds, but that is a major where it certainly can be a great major. But I do think a student needs to be aware of the impact that can have on the application because of how many students are wanting to study computer science. We also see business as one that in the last 4 years has become a lot more competitive, has been more competitive on the coursework a student has to have, and is just generally more competitive. Engineering, pre-med, nursing, architecture, those kind of majors are oftentimes going to, at some schools, make it even more competitive for a student, and is going to also require that a student have a lot of activity that shows they're fit to that. But I do think that sometimes students just sort of pick majors randomly and don't realize the long-term impact that has on their application. So that decision of major, when you're thinking in highly selective, is a really critical strategy point to think about, and think about how one's going to fit with that, and what schools are going to, where that may make it a whole lot more difficult. We're based in Austin, Texas. Computer science is a 3% acceptance rate because it's one of the top programs in the country. Well, there's a bazillion examples like that, right? And so understanding your major's impact is something that I think sometimes feels really nuanced to families, and it's something that you really do want to consider as you're planning.
So
This
we
is
have a great question that came up related to that is, can you apply to a less selective major and then switch? And what about undecided?
Oh, good question. So I'm not a huge fan of trying to do the bait and switch because, especially if we look at the flagships, a lot of the flagships, it's hard to change your major. So then you're saying yes to something that you may not want. Now, I think if a student has a number of majors that they're interested in, maybe thinking strategically about which one might be more better can work. I think there are a lot of colleges around the country that really value undecided majors and have great exploratory programs, and that can be good. However, if you are applying to a highly selective college, you could have three things you're interested in, but you've got to have intellectual curiosity, and you've got to be able to show some areas of academic interest. That might not have to be one thing. And that's going to be a little bit more dependent on which colleges you're applying to, but not having defined academic interests is going to hurt a student. Bob, you have anything to add to that?
No, no. I think for many parents on this Zoom, this idea of the role that college major plays on selectivity seems almost foreign, right? Many of us can't even remember what our first major was at a college, and we changed our major 3 times. Because these schools have become so inundated with applications, many of them, not all, but many of them have placed a greater emphasis on major. This is particularly the case with the flagship publics that Lisa mentioned. Okay, we're going to turn our attention now to the statistics, the numbers. As an overview on these results, I want to make 2 comments. One, these are updated as of an hour ago. Stats come out, they change, schools update. Number 2, many high schools share some anonymized version of their results, either on their student information system or in a follow-up to the end of the season. Your mileage may vary. Your numbers may be really, really different. The source for all these numbers are what the colleges or universities report in their press releases or on their admissions websites in the last several days. Now, the Common Application, the platform that kids apply to, for the 5th year in a row, reported an increase in applications. If you live in the South, you live in a part of the country that is driving a lot of that growth. Okay. Also, international applications came back strong this year. And a thing for parents and students to understand is the application growth disproportionately came from kids applying to more highly selective schools. What does that mean? We had a great question of like, Could you send me a list of highly selective schools so my student could only apply to one or two? That would buck the trend of the last several years, where a student who applied to one highly selective school oftentimes applied to five. So there's a correlation between I'm reaching for selectives and I'm going to have a bigger college list. Now, families often focus and news reports often highlight core sets of schools. And so we picked four. We could have covered 80. Yale, huge increase, continued trend. UT, fourth year in a row that they said we have record applications. If you're not auto admit at the University of Texas at Austin, you pretty much should assume it's almost as hard as an Ivy League school, depending on your major. Harvard, the outlier in this year's press results, their applications fell, and there's plenty of prognostication of why that happened. And then Northeastern, which has really shifted its positioning, became even more popular, and as a result, saw a huge amount of application increase over the past 4 years. Now, we're going to share with you some very specific data, and we'll be sharing that in the follow-up. So trust me, if you're my age, this might look like an eye chart. But what we wanted to show you is over the course of 2020 to 2024, how things have shifted. Look at USC, a school that prior to this sea change was at a 16% admit rate. It landed at a 9. BU, which at some point in the near past might have seemed like a possible for most schools, it's more competitive than some Ivies. And Georgia Tech, a huge example of a flagship public that has basically been deluged with applications. Their admissions director said, we cannot hire enough people to read all these applications. So you can see in sort of a quick view of schools, some of the schools that Lisa mentioned, the sort of favorites, the Harvards, the MITs, the Yales. But you can also see some schools that even 7 years ago, you wouldn't have put into this category, like Tulane, that are now firmly in a category of a highly selective school. Lisa, are there any schools on here that you want to draw folks' particular attention to?
I think it's not so much, but I would say I would give it the 7 that goes to 5 and 4, those are that is actually really significant. It can sound small, but when we're dealing with such small numbers, it's not small. Do you know what I'm saying? So I think if you look at Yale, for example, the 7 to 4, well, that almost cut in two again, right? When we thought 7 was so I think that it is difficult for people to sort of digest how small some of these numbers are. And when we get to, an even broader list, that some of these schools that were really more like what we would have imagined an Ivy, if you take a Boston, look at where they are now, again, they've cut almost in two. That means that has a huge impact on who's getting in and who's not. And I think it's sometimes, students take this so personally. Also, if we look at like a Duke, I mean, it's just, it's nuts. So it's something that for those of us that have been in the field, it's hard to see. But I think for you to sort of see the numbers just eking down, it does tell a story of where we're going, which ultimately is why when we get to list, we have to be more careful. Again, another example of 2024 UCLA, Virginia, all of these with really, in that 4-year period, you've got a lot of shift. Bob?
And one of the things that we thought might be helpful for everyone is to sort of take a snapshot of when many of us might have last been in the college admissions world either when we applied to college ourselves or might have applied to grad school, and compare schools. And I took a family through this recently, and they literally said, "You're going to have to give me a minute to orient myself to this because this is basically a conversion chart that says what Harvard was in 2003 is the admit rate that Boston College has this year. What Cornell had in 2003 is what Tennessee had this year. And that is almost disorienting, right? To sort of adapt to what the mile markers were, what the names were that we often pointed to, a Dartmouth, a Cornell. I worked with a mom the other day who went to Columbia, and she said, Holy Cross? You really got to be kidding me. Holy Cross. And I said, Holy Cross. Yes. So this ability to sort of take the numbers as they are, remind yourself there are great stories of kids succeeding at Bucknell in terms of admissions, at BC, at Harvard, at Penn, but to reorient yourself from, oh, well, that school's a slam dunk, to nowadays, what is that school and where does it fit in the landscape of highly selective schools? Now, a couple of folks ask, are these stats that we shared a moment ago regular decision? Okay. Those are regular decision stats. We wanted to share with you some of the early decision stats because highly selective schools are most often the schools that offer some kind of early decision option. And there's a host of those options. We could spend an entire other webinar talking about the differences between ED, ED2, REA, all those differences. We just decided to pull some of the more significant cases where these highly selective schools are using early decision as a way to both drive applications and cherry pick a class. And I want to draw your attention to 3 columns on this. Column number 1, the early decision admit rate. Column number 2, the multiplier. How significant the difference is between that early decision admit rate and the regular admit rate. At Northeastern, your admit rate for early decision is 3 times the regular decision admit rate. And then one of the stats that is crucial to understand is what percentage of their class do they fill through early decision. UVA, University of Virginia, one of the few flagships that offer an actual full ED. It's a significant difference between the regular decision admit rate and the early decision admit rate, but they admit only 24% of their incoming class through early decision. Contrast that with Tulane, where the multiplier is significant and almost more than 2/3 of their incoming class are coming in through early decision. Kids who apply to highly selective schools are disproportionately kids who consider and utilize ED. And there's an entire strategic conversation about that that isn't appropriate for today, but it is something to understand as a consideration for the statistics and for the decisions and priorities. Lisa, any other comments you want to add on early decision?
No, I think one of the things to always understand is that early decision pulls in a lot of other things, athletes, legacies. We're seeing legacy taking less precedence. So, but we do see a lot of students who are in considering highly selective schools going ED. I will say, we certainly had some good ED results, but I feel like our regular decision results were even better. So I never want students to feel like they have to do ED. We see students getting into highly selective schools every year in multiple different schools, not going ED. So I think it's a really personal decision that, like Bob said, you could do a whole webinar on how you know if you should apply ED. You shouldn't think just because you're applying to a highly selective school, you absolutely have to. Could be a good strategic option, but that's going to be individual.
And Lisa, do all schools offer ED?
Not all schools, but most of your highly selectives are going to have some round that may be a, restricted early action, singles choice early action. There's going to be some flavor. Yes.
On webinars like this, particularly for highly selective, one of the topics that comes up, particularly since the pandemic, is test optional. Prior to the pandemic, less than 5% of schools were test optional. Last year, 98% of schools were test optional. For highly selective schools, we always suggest you think about it with air quotes. Highly selective schools sometimes really focus on test scores. And on the other hand, there are kids that we work with this year that did quite well at highly selective schools where test scores weren't part of their application. As a result of test optional, the average test scores have actually increased because kids, for the most part, are only submitting strong test scores. And many of you may have noticed that over the last several months, some of the more selective schools have announced that they're shifting back to requiring test scores. The good news about test score data, colleges and universities report their test score ranges. So you can see the top quartile in terms of the ACT or SAT for all schools. And then the last thing we want to give you a sense of before we turn our attention to students and parents is how schools consider these choices. They're crafting a class. They're looking at a diversity of perspectives and experiences, and they have their own specific set of institutional priorities. And those institutional priorities often change year to year, and they often play a larger or smaller role in the class that a college or university crafts.
So one of the things we want to talk about is the priorities for students applying to highly selective schools, because there's a lot of things that you can do to help position yourself and to explore during high school that will help you if you have your eye on highly selective schools. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's in your control and what's out of your control. So what's out of your control is what Bob just mentioned. Every institutional has priorities, and you don't necessarily know what those are. It could be that they're looking for a certain part of the country. It could be that they want more Pell eligible schools. It could be that they want more legacies to help their development. It could be that they have not enough philosophy majors. It could go on and on and on. So you can't control that. You're going to apply, and there's going to be some things that that school is looking for that you're going to have no idea and you couldn't control even if you knew. You also can't control the other applicants. So just because, so and so does something, you can't control that piece. And you can't control the applicant pool. You won't know who else is applying. You won't know how strong you are. Even when we look at percentages of acceptances, sometimes I say to a student, well, that's a 7% is different than this 7% because the pool's a little different. Do you know what I'm saying? So you're not going to be able to control other people, the applicant pool, or the institutional priorities. The good news is there is a lot you can control and there's a lot you can do. So let's start out and talk about one of the things that absolutely step one is your academics. So for most of these schools, we're looking that if you're aiming for highly selective schools, you're looking to take the highest rigor available at your school, and you're looking your transcript, i.e. your grades, you're looking to have almost all A's. That doesn't mean you couldn't have a B in there somewhere, but you're going to have mostly A's. Ideally, you'll have test scores, is what I would say. One of the things that has become really challenging is because of test optional, for schools that remain test optional, it's shocking how high of test score you have to be able to send it. So, and I think that's one of the reasons some colleges are rethinking this policy. But ideally, no one ever has everything nailed, just to realize that, right? But in a perfect world, you would have a strong test score. your resume, we'll talk more about this, but the activities, the things that you participate in, where you've had leadership, all of those things are going to fit into this puzzle. And remember, or not remember, but one of the things to know is that in the first read, your grades and your test scores are can be, you know, the real wow factor. But when you get past that and everybody's sort of similar, then it's really about what you've done, what how you can reflect, what your major is, have you shown interest, you know, a lot of different things play into that second read that I think it's surprising to people. We often, Bob and I always get at least one email a year, which is, I can't believe my student who has X grades and X test score didn't get into X college. Now, it could have been in the things you can't control category, or it could be that the bottom half of this could have been a little bit light, especially around activities. So that's something that students can control. All of these things are within your realm. And they're all things that if you're looking at highly selective schools, you really have to start controlling these in high school, like all of high school. This is not a junior year, oh, I think I'll just, you know, decide to do this. This is something you probably want to be working on throughout, not over focusing on because you want to be in high school, but you do want to have this on your radar throughout high school. Bob, you want to talk about these?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of people ask this question, and so we wanted to share this for a subset of schools. If you are an absolute data nerd, you can go online. Colleges are required to publish what's called the Common Data Set. And the Common Data Set really tries to lay out what do the test scores look like and what does the student's position in her class look like. And we just took a subset to show you the kind of ranges that are out there for these selective schools. And, you know, probably is not surprising at all that for these selective schools, they're looking at test scores. You know, the SAT is a 1,600 point test. The ACT is a 36-point test. So you're looking at classes and schools that can afford to expect the majority of those kids who submit test scores to be at the top. And as Lisa said, they're expecting that kids have taken the most rigorous classes and have excelled at those classes. So, you know, you're looking at all of these schools where you have that one person who wasn't in the top 25% of their class, but got into Tulane. And the answer is absolutely. But Tulane reports that 98% of the students they'd admitted were in the top 25%. And I had a student the other day say, I can pretty much tell you if I'm in the top 10% or 25% of my class. Colleges and universities know this because of the profile that a high school submits with the transcript. And this is a crucial thing to understand and is something that once you have your junior year test scores and your junior year transcript, you can really sit down and say, Dartmouth is an academic extreme reach, or Rice, my academic profile is a great fit for it. So there's really a sense of academics at these highly selective schools are a crucial part of a student's story. Lisa, what else is a crucial part of that student story?
So let's get to the fun part, I would say, which is what are the things that the student's going to do to show initiative and impact? So Bob and I have, I don't know, it's now been a lot of years ago, but we were sitting around trying to think about how to think about activity. And so in the middle, you have the student, and the student has their aptitudes, their skills, their motivation, their interests. Students can do initiative and impact in many ways. They could be in music, athletics, their academics, independent projects, community service. But one of the things that holds together strong students in the highly selective pool is beyond those academics. In other words, you're in the top 10% of your class, you have a great test score, or you're so amazing that you can live without the test score. they have these things. And I think all of us on this screen, we were really thrilled with our results from our students this year. And we could look at the work that they had done to cultivate the impact and the initiative and how that shined through their applications. And so this can't be made up. It's got to be student led, but the ability to show the what else do you have is really critical. And I would say showing some academic or intellectual curiosity is important, and showing some character and care for the common good is also really important. But these are where students hopefully can lean into things they love. This is not about making stuff up for the college admissions process. This is students who are naturally driven to want to go further, to want to do more because they have that level of curiosity and interest. And so, yes, they may need a little guidance sometimes to help, like, what do you think? Where would I go from here or whatever? But a lot of that is going to come internally from students. But this is where we see students start to really stand out and be able to grow and shine.
One,
Would you add? Yeah.
yeah, one anecdote I would share. I work with a student who's a huge fan of women's college basketball. She's a Caitlin Clark fan, and she said, "I get it. You make the tournament on your academics. You win your tournament on impact and initiative." What can oftentimes make that difference between those two incredibly gifted, academically rigorous students is what they did outside of the classroom. The intellectual curiosity, the commitment to common good, the activities related to a field of study. And what I think Lisa and Allison and I have found is this is not optional. There is no strong transcript or perfect test score in the world that can offset a student who hasn't been engaged outside of the classroom. And this isn't Google Maps. This isn't one size fits all. Check these boxes, and this is who Duke wants you to be. This is unique to the student.
And I think one of the things that we believe is that this engagement is actually good for students. If they're doing it and it's just because someone told them to do it, that's not good for students. But if students truly are leaning into, I was just meeting with a student who's so excited about some of the things he's working with, and you just came across the Zoom, and I was like, that is just so cool. Yes, that's going to be great on his college application, but what's even better is it's bringing him joy right now. Right now in his life, he feels better about himself from what he's doing from that. And that's when we get at the sweet spot of this. Now, it's really important for students to start taking steps to think about these things. They're going to have to start somewhere, right? So if your student is younger, I think one of the things that we notice is that sometimes families are worried, like, oh, they don't know their thing and they're in the eighth grade. And we're like, right, they're in exploratory time. So you have to explore first before you're going to be able to start leaning more and more into initiative and impact. And when we say impact, I always say to a student, whatever they're working on, like, how is this thing going to be different because you were here? How is your neighborhood, your community? What is it you did that's going to actually change something? And that may be someone's life, that may be a policy, that may be a bazillion different things, your team, but like, how are things different because you are here? And I do think it's important to mention that in highly selective schools, we are talking about probably just doing things at your school base. Is you're going to need to extend beyond that. You're where, how far you reach out. So where did you take initiative and how far does your impact go actually matter. So sometimes, we say, okay, you're going to do something at a state level or regional level. So you want to think about that. Those are all building things, though. They're not going to, a student is not starting there in the eighth grade. Bob, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think this point that Lisa made about scope and scale is so crucial. Students that excel in admissions at highly selective schools, they drive an impact not just at their school, but beyond their school. And it might be a community of faith that they're involved in that they've gotten involved in globally. It might be a competition that they've excelled at in the world competition for that. But it is a clear distinction that we see in students that excel at highly selective schools versus students who excel at the schools who have an admissions rate just above these, just a tad less competitive. When a parent said or a student said, what made the difference? It's oftentimes the lasting impact and the depth of initiative that that student took. And as Lisa said, that's sophomore and junior. That is a really important thing to add. Now,
Absolutely.
Lisa, this idea of highly selective and what students can do, can you talk a little bit about the importance nowadays of a balanced college list?
Absolutely. I think that, you can reach as many schools as you want to reach to. Like, the way I work with my students is like, yeah, you should put all those on there that you want to, but you need to be equally balanced, on the other side. We lay out kind of a typical, list strategy, but I think one of the things that I would highly recommend families consider is have you reach schools and do everything you can to get there, but spend time also on your possible schools, those schools that are maybe just below that, and spend some time there. Like when you're going to make visits, when you're doing things, spend some time there so that you haven't set the stage for these places that have 4%, 5% acceptance rates. Don't bet the whole farm on that. That is a really bad strategy. And it's also a bad strategy, in my opinion, to bet all but two on it, because did you really want to go to those two? Give yourself some more options on both sides. Now, unfortunately, that sometimes means we have bigger lists. But I think that in the world that we're in, that's a better strategy than just filling it all with reaches because you're really, you've got a 4.0 and you've got your 35 and all the things. The sad thing is we've got too many people who have all those things, right? And so there is some parts of this that is that doesn't always make sense, I guess. So what we recommend to parents is we absolutely want you to have your reaches, but spend a little time on those possibles, go visit some of them so that at the end of the day, your student's going to have great options. So what we wanted to do is talk with you guys a little bit about some students who have thrived in admissions in highly selective schools. As we said, we have the pleasure of working with a lot of students. And so one of the things that we wanted to look at is the common profile, which we've talked about a little bit. So I'm just going to kind of is your academics and your in this graph, we're really considering your test scores, all the things that have to do with numbers and grades in the middle. But then you want to have some fit to major activity so that you're able to show that you actually match your major. Oftentimes your intellectual curiosity matches with that, but not always. Sometimes you are also curious about something else. And then common good. And again, sometimes you're common good. And common good is not just service hours. Service hours are really yesterday's news. It's what is it you want to do to make this world a better place? That's really where the rubber meets the road. And so making sure that there is something that's coming through in that application that's showing character and concern for other people is going to be really important.
Lisa, a question on this. If a student works incredibly hard and they excel in terms of that academics, they take APs, they do a 36 on their ACT, but they don't really have the other circles, intellectual curiosity, fit to major, common good. What should they do if they want to have some of these highly selective schools on their list? Is it just not an option? Or if there's a parent on this Zoom who has a student that fits that profile, and they're about to be a junior, what advice do you have?
Well, I think it's oftentimes there's things under the surface of really bright kids that where they have interests in things, but it hasn't quite been sussed out into an activity. So I mean, Allison is sort of the queen of this, I would say. She can find these things that kids are doing that I'm like, oh, wow, how did you get that out of them? So I think first is to take a deeper look and make sure my guess is with a lot of bright kids, there are threads in there that just need to be pulled out and pulled through. So they may need to add additional activities, expand things. But I like to start by looking at what we've got and see, like, wait a minute, because it's great if something isn't terribly common. It's actually, all the standard positive things that everyone has doesn't really do a lot to make your application shine in this world. So the first thing is to make sure we don't have some unusual things in there that we could pull out. And the second thing is, if the student is so motivated to get active, start now. Yeah. And we have worked with some students who were pretty light in junior year and really picked up the pace. In terms of common profile of our students, and this, we said this really in that graph that Bob said, is that they're going to have taken the most rigorous classes. They're going to typically be in the top 5 to 10% of their class. Their resume is going to have a depth of initiative and impact. The last thing that we haven't talked about, and something that you can do at home, is the college application. Much of the writing is really an exercise in how deeply can a student reflect on their experiences. This, unfortunately, is not taught in school a lot. And so anytime your student is doing something, if you can help them start working that reflection muscle, that's going to help them in the college process, because this, and smart kids, I don't know why, but the stronger the kids are in grades, the harder time they sometimes have in reflecting, because they want to get the right answer. And there's not a right answer to reflection. So this is something that I think you can work on at home to start building, and is absolutely critical when you get to the application process. And is one of the things we find ourselves doing with students a lot, is trying to help pull those things out to get them to reflect, because it isn't something that they're naturally doing in school.
Lisa, what about the intangibles, the profile of the students that do well?
Well, I think number one, they're self-driven. I don't think parents can push students into being this. And I realize that that might be a little bit of bad news. Our experience is that most of the highly selective kids that we work with come to the table driven for this. That doesn't mean they don't maybe need a guide on the side, but they hold the driving of wanting to do this. I do also want to say a lot of their parents are great thinking partners in helping them realize their dreams. So I do think parents are very critical, but I don't think a parent can push a student to want this. They tend to be competitive. Not all of them. I worked with a wonderful young man this year who wasn't terribly competitive and hated to brag, and I was so worried, and he knocked it out of the park. So because he came through. I think they do tend to have some time and energy where they're working to make the world better, and they're genuinely curious, and curiosity comes through in their application. Those are, there's certainly many other common traits, but I think when we think about the kids that we work with that really knock it out or overperform, because let's be honest, although the numbers are scary, there are kids that do overperform, and they almost always have these traits.
Lisa, I know it's hard to visualize what exactly this means to at a student level. Could you maybe talk about a couple of examples of students we've had the joy of working with who have thrived in this process? And obviously, just to let everybody know, these are anonymized examples. These are not specific students, but can you give a feel for what this actually looks like?
Yeah, I'm going to use an example, and then Allison will. Both of us will give a quick example. I worked with a female athlete. I started with her in the 8th grade. In the 8th grade, really, the only thing that she knew, she liked two things. She liked her sport, and she liked political science. So then we had COVID year for her freshman year. And so during that year, she did some advocacy work with the city council representative, and she went out and stayed, in shape for her sport. That's about all she could do. Then the next year, she got really into her sport when she was back at school. And she started thinking about that in this realm of political, she was interested in political science, but working with the mayor and some of the other things that she did, she got really interested in sustainability as well. And she started thinking about sustainability on the sports field. And she got involved in a national organization that was trying to encourage sustainability in sports and at sporting events and things like that. And then she brought what she learned at this national conference back to her school and to her community. She also did a really interesting thing, and I think this is where Common Good throws in. She started working with the groundskeeper on the field that she played at all the time to try to implement some of these things, which made the groundskeeper's job easier. And so she got dirty. She got her hands dirty with it, which I think showed. She also had some other really interesting interests. She was a gardener. She had elderly neighbor that she took care of a lot. She was in choir. So she wasn't just a one show person. And yet she really had this great sport that she was good at. And she had this deep interest in sustainability. She also continued to work in the political science arena, and she knocked it out of the park in her with highly selective schools, and was a really interesting candidate for sure. Allison, you want to share yours?
Absolutely. I had the pleasure of working with a young man. We started when he was a sophomore, and he came committed to pursuing architecture at highly selective schools. And you may or may not know that architecture, even at a not highly selective school, is an incredibly selective major because those programs are small. He was incredibly committed to architecture at a highly selective school. And he was absolutely in the game of exploring architecture. I think he did 4 or 5 informational interviews with architects that he had worked that network. He met one architect, talked to them, then said, could you help me connect with someone else who does a different type of architecture? And literally did 5 or 6 informational interviews on his own during his sophomore year. One of those interviews turned into a shadowing opportunity that was a couple weeks long that summer. Absolutely, again, kind of really deepened that relationship, developed the skills that he needed, and kept that going all through high school, even into his senior year. Even winter break after his applications were submitted. He did an internship over winter break of his senior year in architecture. Again, not because he needed to, because he was really curious and really committed. In addition, though, he was deeply curious and really looking for feedback about his architecture portfolio. He reached out to admissions representatives at the schools where he was applying and said, do you know someone who could give me feedback on my portfolio? He went to the National Portfolio Days, and then he implemented the feedback in his architecture portfolio and went back to them and said, thank you so much. These are the changes I made based on the feedback that you gave me, which was, and again, it was completely authentic. He actually just really wanted to know how to make it better. And then finally, outside of the deep architecture, right? And he was a student, he was barely in the top 10%, had kind of a mid-range test score. But was so deeply curious and committed outside of architecture that he volunteered to be an announcer at his school sports team. They had never had one before. He thought he'd try it. He also worked with another student, and they developed a proposal for an area of their neighborhood that had kind of fallen into disrepair. And they made a proposal to the city council about what they might do with that area, something that they could do that wouldn't cost any money. Again, just someone who is deeply curious, deeply committed, and in every activity that this student participated in, he invited other people to do it too. Like for the city council, he said, you know what? I'm going to invite a friend to help me with this because he also likes to build things. In the newspaper, it was like, you know what? We don't have a lot of freshmen. I'm going to find out a way we could get more freshmen on the newspaper. And so that was just kind of the way he did it. And it came right through in his story.
One comment I would make, 2 of the students I worked with, while they were excited on the day that they heard yes from some of these highly selective schools, they were overjoyed by the high school experience that they had, the engagement they had, the impact they had. That was their joy. Yeah, they're excited about next year. Trust me, they're wearing that t-shirt, that sweatshirt. But I think the mark here is that both of the examples that the examples shared here that Lisa and Allison walked through, they're indicative of so many of the students that we work with who have thrived in the admissions process for highly selective schools. And that is, they never did things because, quote unquote, it looked good to a college. That was an afterthought in a way. What the driver was is who they are and what they wanted to do with their precious time in high school.
So as we wrap up, I think one of the things that's helpful to think about is what can you as parents do? And I'm just going to quickly go over a couple of these things. We talked about this. If you're going on a college trip, go see those highly selective schools and enjoy it. And while you're at it, see some possibles too. So enjoy all of it, but enjoy the range. And then I think be realistic. If your student really doesn't fit the profile that we outlined of students, you know what? That is absolutely fine. There are so many great colleges out there. And so I think as parents, sometimes we think, oh, this is the only way. If your student genuinely doesn't feel this passion for this, let it go and focus on a great college experience, because otherwise it's just going to be a battle. I would say virtual visits also are a great thing to do to learn about your possibles and matches. So that's another great thing to do. Let your student react to colleges and have their experience before you tell your opinion, I think is helpful. And be honest about if there's financial deal breakers, be honest right now. I'm working with a family that was so honest with their student, and he is one of my overperformers that landed with some, Ivy acceptance that we weren't expecting. And so that's hard because of finances. So be honest about where you're going to be, because he's handling it so well because he's known all along. In terms of helping your student thrive on this journey, we can't stress enough. I think, for us, this is our theology is engagement. We believe it's the best thing students can do in high school to grow as human beings outside the college process. But I do think that the engagement is critical, but don't think this has got to be cookie cutter recipe. Let it take the natural arcs and turns and things that it's going to take. Start with your criteria, not just hearing what everyone else is where they're wanting to go. Be willing to look outside the names and keep the names in too, maybe, look at honors programs. That's a great way to get some possibles in there and get some great rigor and in there. I would, refrain from waiting until summer of senior year. With the nature of highly selective colleges right now, this is a high school journey. When students get to essays and applications, be genuine, be authentic, take some risks, be vulnerable. And for the love of God, don't crowdsource your essays, because they won't be vulnerable, authentic, and all those things if 1,000 people edit them.
We are so grateful to have this time. As you can tell, we love talking about this topic. We have been lucky enough to work with so many students who over the last couple of weeks have gotten great news. And many of those students heard that great news from highly selective schools. Many of those students heard those from schools that are not in the category of schools that we talked about this evening. Some of you who are on this Zoom this evening will be really interested in the fact that UT Austin about 3 weeks ago, after announcing their admissions results, announced we are radically changing our admissions criteria. Radically changing. So we have a webinar that we hadn't planned in a couple of weeks to really walk families whose students are planning to apply to UT through those changes and the implications of those changes. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be going back to these admissions results and doing a deep, deep dive across all the different kinds of schools and all the different kinds of students. You will get an email from us tomorrow with the recording for this webinar, with information on these 2 upcoming webinars, and with a couple of other resources. We want to leave you with this thought. As Allison so often says with students, it is great to shoot for the stars. Have a plan, have a rocket ship, and be conscious that you can shoot for the stars, but be in the right galaxy. Make sure you have a balanced list. For the parents that are on this Zoom, we wish you great success with your students' journey to college. And if we can help in any way, please just let us know. It was great to be with you this evening, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars.